Hi, so my name is Gaudelet. I'm an Associate Director of Machine Learning at Therapeutics, and I'm here to introduce PyRelationAL, a Python package that we've made public recently for active learning development. First, I'll start by giving a quick primer on active learning that will serve as an incomplete introduction to the field as well as a way to set some vocabulary. So the first key concept is the idea of world. Essentially, it corresponds to the set of samples that we'd consider in a given scenario. So for instance, it could be a large database of images or the set of all possible combinations of FDA-approved drugs. It is generally large and sparsely labeled, and we're basically interested in exploring the world better. The second key notion is the idea of oracle. An oracle corresponds to a person or process that's able to provide labels for each of the samples in the world. For instance, it can be a human going through the image database and labeling them based on the content, or it could be laboratory experiments that establish a synergy of a given combination of drugs. Critically, it is typically expensive to ask the oracle for labels, and we want to do this as little as possible. So as such, the goal of the active learning practitioner is to develop a model that gives a good approximation of the oracle. Importantly, this should be under a budget constraint in the form of a limit to the number of possible calls to the oracle. Note that in some instances, we principally care about the model being able to reliably identify a certain subclass of the world. For instance, in the drug combination example, we'd be caring more about finding highly synergistic drug combination. So active learning typically works in an iterative fashion that starts with training, whereby the model is trained using a subset of labeled samples in the world. So in the next step, each unlabeled sample is scored using some notion of informativeness. And by informativeness, we mean a measure of how much we believe having a given sample's label would improve the model performance. This is a difficult question to answer in general, and choosing or designing the right notion of informativeness for a given scenario is a critical step of active learning. It often relies on some estimate of the uncertainty of the model, but you can also use some distance metric to identify samples that are diverse from the current label set. So the idea being that we want to query samples that are not already represented in a current training set. So based on those scores that we compute in the previous step, then we pick a number of samples that can then be sent, queried for label, essentially. And these can be simply selected as the ones that maximize the notion of informativeness chosen, or they can be selected in a more complex fashion, for instance, combining multiple notions of informativeness. For instance, combining diversity and uncertainty can be beneficial to some scenarios, like ensuring that we explore certain parts of the world without oversampling each. Like it might be suboptimal to query all samples from exactly the same part of the world that we know is uncertain. And we want to make sure that it's as diverse as possible across the board. The next step is to query the oracle for labels for those selected samples, and then update the state of the world based on the oracle's input. The process can then start again from the updated world, and the loop continues until the budget is spent or until some performance level is reached. Note that the budget is decomposed into hyperparameters: the need tuning, the number of iterations, and the number of queries at each iteration. Right. So we now have a high-level picture of the active learning process, and we can now switch to talking about the package itself. PyRelationAL is a flexible Python library that enables fast implementation of active learning pipelines, both for research and reproduction. There are three main components to any active learning process: the dataset, the model, and the strategy. And we will detail them in the following part of the talk. But for now, note that we are also working towards adding some benchmark datasets in a future release that will help make the active learning development easier. And also, while PyRelationAL is principally designed with PyTorch in mind. It can easily be interfaced with other libraries such as scikit-learn, JAX, and TensorFlow. And there's a few examples to this effect in the repository. Right, so diving into PyRelationAL, we start with a PyRelationAL data manager, which stores datasets as well as the indices of the various subsets, including train, validation, and test sets. The train set is at the center of the active learning framework and is further decomposed into the labeled and unlabeled pools of samples that are updated as the iterative process progresses. Validation and test sets are in PyRelationAL somewhat external to the process and solely used for model selection and evaluation. Note that the data manager also handles data loader creation during the entire process. So in our illustration, the data manager comes into play at the purple edges, so like for data splits as well as for the world update. Cool. So the next major component is a model wrapper. A PyRelationAL model essentially wraps around a user-defined model and handles instantiation, training, and evaluation, as well as uncertainty quantification if needed. Note that some models inherently provide some measure of the uncertainty, for instance Gaussian processes, while others rely on some heuristics such as ensembling or MC dropout. So PyRelationAL natively provides wrappers for MC dropout and ensembling. That works well with PyTorch Lightning, but can also be integrated with other type of models. So back to our illustration, the model manager would intervene at the green edges, so when training and optionally when scoring unlabeled samples. The final part of the puzzle is the active learning strategy. In PyRelationAL, this is implemented within a class that also interfaces the data and model managers with the Oracle as well. So to implement a specific active learning strategy, one only needs to subclass the generic active learning strategy class and override the active learning step method. And PyRelationAL provides a number of implementation for existing strategy for classification and regression tasks, as well as for some task agnostic strategies. And going back to our illustration, the strategy comes at the orange edges. So for scoring, since the strategy will define the informativeness notion used in the scenario, as well as the query step, where it defines how we select samples based on the informativeness. Right, so we have now introduced all the main components of PyRelationAL, and we now walk through a quick demo to demonstrate how to set up an active learning pipeline. And diving into the demo, we first import the package, check the version, and import all the packages that are useful for experiment. Then we'll define our dataset. So we're using a very small dataset for this example that comes from UCI, database of datasets. So this particular dataset is about wines. So each data point would be a wine described by 11 property features, and then labeled by quality of the wine, which is a score between 0 and 10. And we basically want to predict this based on the 11 features we have. So we'll define a very simple linear regression model that takes in the 11 features and predict the quality of the wine. And we're using PyTorch Lightning for this, so we're defining the various methods that are required. So training step, validation step, test step, as well as the optimizers. And note that we are storing validation loss and test loss. So test loss for evaluation, validation loss for model selection. Right, so we have now everything to set up PyRelationAL run. So starting from creating our data manager, so here we define a function, taking in the data set and randomly splitting it and returning a manager for it. Then we'll define our model. So we use a MC dropout heuristic as a way to estimate uncertainty of the model. And so we use Lightning as a base. So we define a trainer config with 500 epochs at most, using GPUs, some early stopping with patience 25, and then a validation loss as a metric to be tracked for model selection. For MC dropout, we'll use 25 estimators with a 25% chance of dropout. Right, for the following, we'll define a few helper functions, starting from an extra metric on top of the mean-squared error loss. So we're interested in finding high-quality wine, essentially. So we want to see how quickly our strategy will sort of zero in onto the higher quality, the top 5% wine in terms of quality. Then we define a run strategy function that is just runs the strategy for a few iterations. And store results as we go along, and we have a plot function as well. So now we're ready to define our strategy, and we'll look at two very simple strategies in this example. So like the random acquisition strategy, which is independent of the model and just randomly samples from the unlabeled pool, and the greedy strategy that we pick the ones that the model rates as being the highest quality, essentially. So let's look at the results. So on the left, we have the mean-squared error in function of the iteration index, the active learning iteration, and on the right, we have the hit ratio. So the left picture doesn't give us much, like it doesn't seem that one strategy is better than the other. There might be a slight edge for random acquisition strategy, but that's not like strong conclusion to do from this run. On the right, however, we can see that the greedy strategy zeroes much quicker on higher quality wines, which is good because then we don't have to taste the bad quality wine. Right, to finish this demo, we'll just look at a quick implementation of an epsilon greedy strategy which interpolates somewhat between the random strategy and the greedy strategy. Some of you may be familiar with it from the reinforcement learning world. But essentially, it's a percentage of point would be selected at random, whilst the other remaining percentage would be selected greedily. And now we can look at the results that we get from this. And basically, yeah, so like we can see on the left again, there's not much conclusion that can be drawn. And on the right, it performs similarly to the greedy strategy with a slight edge for the greedy strategy. Which goes to show that it interpolates between the two. Right. So this is the extent of the talk. Here we give a few references for those of you interested in diving deeper into active learning. The first three correspond to textbooks or reviews of active learning, while the last two are recent application of active learning to biomedical questions. The latter correspond to our joint work with Mila, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for which you can find a talk on our booth. I'd like to mention that PyRelationAL is in active development and it can always be improved. You can find the repository at this address, and if you consider contributing, please do check our guidelines and code of conduct. Also, feel free to reach out at software@relationrx.com if you have any questions. Before ending, I'd like to acknowledge all the awesome colleagues that have worked on the project, so Paul, Suraj, Alison, Jyotish, and Jake, as well as the rest of the amazing team at Relation that have helped directly or indirectly at some point. Also, it's a good point to mention that we are hiring and looking for machine learning researchers and engineers. And finally, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and do come talk to us if you have any question. We'll be available on the booth.